If anyone ever asked me what silence really sounds like, I'd say it's the exact moment a 10-year-old boy in steel leg braces reaches out his trembling hand to a waitress in the middle of Manhattan's most extravagant restaurant and asks her not for water, not for help, not for another soda, but to dance. It happened in one of those places where wealth doesn't whisper. It hums in the air like perfume, where every fork clink lands like a piano note and 5 languages murmur about hedge funds and quarterly returns. And in that meticulously polished world, little Lucas Montgomery, wrapped in cold medical metal and limping through years of silent trauma, brought everything to a halt when he looked up at Diana Johnson, the only black woman on staff, and asked her to dance with him. The pianist kept playing, but the room froze. Then came the sharp voice of the manager, Thornton, slicing through the moment like a blade. "Sir, control your son. This isn't a dance hall." Instantly, the air turned glacial. Even the candles flickered like they were holding their breath. At the head of the table sat Richard Montgomery, billionaire, business titan, and father of the boy who hadn't smiled in 2 years. Not since the car crash that nearly claimed his legs and had turned Richard into a ghost of himself, hiding his son away from the world in guilt and fear. "Lucas, sit down," he said. Calm, heavy, final. But Lucas didn't sit. He just kept standing there, small and shaking but unyielding. Diana looked between her boss, the powerful man at the table, and the boy who hadn't let go of her fingers, and then slowly, she did something that changed everything. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, set it aside, and smiled like the entire restaurant didn't exist. "Can't dance in an apron," she said gently, and took his hand. No instructions, no corrections. She just followed his uncertain lead, step by unsteady step, as the entire dining room watched, stunned. Voices murmured, "She's gone. Fired. Tomorrow for sure." But Lucas didn't hear them. For the first time in years, his face wasn't a mask of pain or fear. It was lit with a fragile, radiant pride. He was leading. He wasn't a patient, a tragedy, a broken boy. He was just a child dancing. The manager hissed that it would never happen again, that Diana would be disciplined. But Richard wasn't listening. He was somewhere else, watching a memory of his late wife, Elizabeth, dancing barefoot in their living room with Lucas, whispering to him that it's not about perfection, it's about connection. When Diana gently returned Lucas to his seat and bowed slightly, saying, "Thank you for asking me out," like he was a grown man and not a boy in braces, the entire room sat in stunned silence. Richard stopped her before she could leave. His voice was low, different. "Your full name?" "Diana Johnson, sir." He handed her a card. "My office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. She took it with hands still shaking, but her back straight, her steps calm, and walked out like someone who had just told the truth in a room that had forgotten how to hear it. Dinner resumed, awkward and hollow, as Richard quietly watched his son, really saw him, for the first time in far too long, realizing what he'd missed, what he'd been too scared to face. The next morning, Diana stepped into the marble lobby of Montgomery Tower in her best sail rack skirt and sensible blouse, clutching an old purse like a shield. She looked out of place next to executives in designer suits who wore more on their wrists than she earned in a month, but she didn't flinch. She introduced herself with quiet grace. "18th floor," the receptionist said. "Miss Winters will see you." In the elevator, she was nervous, but it wasn't fear. It was the quiet courage of someone who had walked through harder storms than judgment. Winters, all icy polish and practiced condescension, eyed her like a stain on the carpet. "Let me guess. He had you fired. Happens. Men like him, women like you. You know your place, right?" Diana just smiled politely. "I do, but maybe you can tell me, where exactly is my place supposed to be?" Winters had no answer. The phone rang. "He'll see you now." Richard's office was a temple to power, sweeping skyline views, cold angles, and silence that made you feel small. He said nothing for a long moment, then opened a folder. "Bachelor's from NYU, Master's in Special Education. 3 jobs, waitress, bookstore clerk, tutor. Freedom Steps, a dance program for children with disabilities. You co-founded it?" "With my sister," Diana said. "We're about to shut it down. No funding." "You didn't come here for money?" he asked. "No," she replied, simply. "And you told me to call you sir, but I'd rather call you Father Montgomery." That surprised him. Then he said, "I want you to work for me." Diana blinked. "As a waitress?" "No," he said, as a therapeutic companion for Lucas. I've hired the best doctors, but what you did yesterday, that wasn't just a dance. It was the first time he smiled. Diana didn't flinch. He doesn't need someone to lead him. He needs someone who knows how to follow. And in that moment, Richard finally understood, not as a billionaire, but as a father who had almost lost his son. Time seemed to pause as Richard leaned forward and said, I'll pay you 5 times what you make. But Diana stood up, calm but unshaken, and said firmly, no, I don't work for people who see my color or my class before they see me, and I won't be bought to patch emotional damage money can't fix. He flushed, not from anger, but disbelief. No one had ever told him no. That's pride, he muttered. No, Diana corrected. That's dignity. Your son deserves more than someone pretending to care. As she turned to leave, she added, Lucas doesn't need more experts. He needs space to lead his own life. She placed a card on his desk. Freedom Steps. Tuesdays and Thursdays. First class is free, if you're ready to let him take it. In the hallway, Winters gawked, stunned. You just turned down Richard. Montgomery. Diana just smiled. Better to be crazy than someone's property. That Wednesday, her sister Zoe, hijab slightly crooked in her nerves, rushed in, breathless. There's a Bentley outside. You won't believe who's in it. Sure enough, Lucas sat wide-eyed in the back seat, and Richard Montgomery, knuckles pale on the steering wheel, sat beside him. He's not coming in, Zoe said. Men like him don't. But Diana just grinned. Never underestimate a son on a mission, and wouldn't you know it, Lucas stepped out first, fiddling with his braces, and Richard, in surprisingly casual clothes, followed close behind. Freedom Steps wasn't much. Just an old warehouse with handmade posters, laughter bouncing off the walls, and kids moving freely like they owned the space. Looks chaotic, Richard muttered. There's structure. You just don't recognize it, Diana replied, then turned to Lucas. Want to join? He nodded, but waited for his dad's silent okay. Go on, Richard said, stiff. Diana guided Lucas in while Zoe offered Richard a seat. First day's hardest for parents, not the kids, she said. This isn't therapy, Richard snapped. I've hired the best, Zoe just asked softly. And how's that working out? Then the studio door opened, and in walked Ela Mercer, legendary Harvard neuroscientist, cane tapping, eyes sharp. Mr. Montgomery, she said, you've rejected my proposals 3 times. Richard went pale. I oversee the program, she said with a smile. Diana added, we're studying how adaptive movement shapes the developing brain. It's dance, but it's also neuroscience. Richard blinked. Then why were you a waitress? Because you, and men like you, said no 3 times. And because funding doesn't fall into the laps of people who look like me. The realization hit him hard. She wasn't just some assistant. She was the co-author on the research he'd ignored. Was the dance staged? He asked. Diana's eyes didn't flinch. No. Lucas led. I followed. Suddenly cameras. And reporters flooded in. The story from Diana's program had just gone live. You used my son, Richard accused. Diana quietly led him to a wall filled with photos of children, each tracking their progress. But one frame remained. Empty. That's for what we're building, she said. A full center. 500 kids a year, not just 50. We had to get your attention somehow. And in that moment, Lucas, in the center of the floor, took off one brace and tried to stand. Alone. Richard moved instinctively, but Diana held him back. Wait, watch! Lucas, wobbling, focused, and took a small, unsupported step. Kids cheered. Cameras clicked. And for once, Richard's face cracked open with awe, not control. That's why we're here, Diana said softly. It's not about perfect steps. It's about first steps. Richard finally saw his son. Not as a project, but as a person. You could have done this without tricking me, he said. We tried, she replied. You never answered our calls. Reporters turned their lenses on him now. He was at a crossroads no amount of money could buy his way out of. Lucas, meanwhile, just kept practicing, joyfully unaware of the storm he'd calmed. Richard looked between his son and the cameras, then faced the crowd. For the first time, he let vulnerability show. You know what's hardest for someone like me? He said. Admitting we're wrong. Silence. Then, the Montgomery Foundation will fully fund Freedom Steps for the next 5 years and build a permanent center, but only if Ms. Johnson keeps full control. Flashes exploded. 3 months later, construction began. Diana was there every day. Lucas, too. sometimes with friends in tow. And surprisingly, Richard kept showing up. No press, just presence. Didn't think you'd come to meetings, Diana teased one day. Didn't think I'd be studying neuroplasticity at 50, he quipped. They traded barbs, but it was no longer Billionaire and Waitress. It was two people rebuilding something together. At the center's opening, Lucas wore just one lightweight brace and danced with the others. Graceful, confident, free. Richard stood in the back beside Diana. He doesn't need you to hold him anymore, she said. Richard nodded, eyes glassy. But he still needs me to be there. That's the difference. He turned to her. Thank you. For what? For teaching me to follow. A reporter called out. Biggest lesson? Richard didn't hesitate. That real leaders aren't the ones dragging everyone behind them. They're the ones brave enough to follow when someone shows them a better way. A year later, Freedom Steps had expanded to new cities. Diana won national recognition. Lucas walked into a regular school with his cane on rough days and gave speeches to kids across the country. And Richard, well, he finally learned that real power isn't about control. It's knowing exactly when to step aside. So I'll leave you with this. Was Diana right to push back? Did Richard finally do the right thing? When is it time to force a reckoning? And when is it time to simply follow? Drop your thoughts below. Because maybe, just maybe, the real revolution starts when someone dares to take the first step, and someone else is finally wise enough to follow.